He had a methodical day and was lacking in nothing. During times of leisure, the company of intellectuals and learned people. Above all, he loved to take walks, which, especially in the early years, he alternated with long rides in the woods. During his holidays, to avoid delays in governing, Urban VIII continued to receive in audience ministers and ambassadors.
Welcome back to the Country House podcast, and thank you, Rory, for that intriguing introduction. We are doing a very special episode today in the light of the death of Pope Francis and the encroaching conclave and selection of a new pope. We thought we would do an episode today, also because it's a spring summer bank holiday. We thought we'd do an episode on the Pope's official summer residence at Castel Gandolfo. Rory, can you tell us, just to kick us off, what is Castel Gandolfo? Where is it? What does it look like? Just tell us a bit about it.
It's a bit of a tongue twister, isn't it? So it's just outside Rome. It's 25 kilometers southeast of Rome, above a lake called Lake Albano, which is very, very sort of beautiful Italian lake, on a sort of cliff. And it's how it looks. It's quite. We'll get to that later on. But it's sort of it's quite hard to describe in that way that sort of castles often are. It's very big. It's sort of whitewashed, creamy, peachy color. It's sort of very, very plain, sort of 17th century from the outside, but with sort of expanding basement level. You can tell it's a castle, with sort of terraced gardens down the side of this hill. Does that make sense? Do you have a picture of it from that description?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it sounds. Is it? I suppose. I assume you said sort of 17th century. I suppose, is it sort of very classical in the style of the Vatican City in terms of its domes and all sorts of things like that?
No, it's not, and we'll get to the design of it later on. I mean, it's got a couple of observatories on it, but they were added much later.
But it's got this wonderful, from what I've seen of pictures in the past, that has got this extraordinary position. It almost looks, if you can't see that it's a lake, it looks almost sort of like it's a sort of Ravello or some sort of wonderful clifftop town in the Amalfi Coast, in the way that it's sort of perched right on the edge of the cliff, isn't it? And all these lovely ochre colours, and the Castella's right next to the town, isn't it? So
yeah,
but then these sprawling gardens on the other side. And I'm keen to hear more about the gardens maybe in due course as well. But let's sort of rewind further back. So this Castel has something to do with Emperor Domitian's palace, doesn't it? Can you tell us about Emperor Domitian and his palace, and I suppose what the background is to Castel Gandolfo?
Yes. So Emperor, well, yes. So it's just totally nuts, really. I mean, one always has this when studying kind of papal treasures, because the history is just so much longer than one can possibly begin to sort of realize, really. So the whole palace and Castel Gandolfo is sort of built on the ruins of the Emperor Domitian's sort of country pad. And he was around, I believe, emperor between 81 and 96 AD. And this palace complex may have also been the heart of the ancient city of Alba Longa, but I don't think we're archaeologists are quite sure about that. But basically, Domitian's villa was on the side of this hill, with terraces sort of going down the side of it. And the middle terrace had the palace and a theatre. The lower terrace had a sort of very long 300-meter corridor that was covered for the emperor. And there were several terraces beneath that, which were mainly gardens. And a lot of the sort of ruins from this palace complex are actually now incorporated into the gardens of the papal palace. So we can talk about that. It's quite cool. There's a very much a sort of continuity in terms of architectural form. Domitian's palace had a sort of rather sad history in a way, because I think it was only really Domitian who used it. The Emperor Hadrian, spent a bit of time there when he was waiting for his own, I think, more famous villa near Tivoli to be completed. And then the sort of famous Marcus Aurelius took refuge there during a big rebellion in 175 AD. But basically, after that, it fell into neglect and was, as with so many Roman ruins, just gradually stripped of its marble for other things. But what I found remarkable is that it was still being stripped of marble in the medieval period, in the 1300s, which gives you a sense of how big it must have been. I mean, there was clearly an awful lot of marble to strip, so it was no small thing. I mean, I think our classical leaders listeners can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was the Emperor Domitian's dynasty. He was a Flavian, I think, and it was the Flavians or the Flavians, I'm not sure how to say it, who built, the Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheater. So they were pretty big builders, and so it doesn't really surprise me that this palace was enormous, basically.
So there was this Roman ruin, I suppose, on the site. And I suppose if you think about it from a strategic perspective, high above the cliffs, not far from Rome, it probably was a very useful position for the Roman Empire.
Absolutely.
So it fell into decline after the fall of Rome. Is that right? That's when it stopped being used as an emperor's palace.
It fell into decline before the fall of Rome. Sorry, my notes aren't very helpful in that regard, because other emperors, I think it was more personal. It wasn't like the sort of the emperor's palace. Your kind of villa was much more of a sort of.
It was like Villa Adriana or whatever. It was sort of.
It was a personal preference.
Specific emperor's house. Yeah.
Yeah, and so when Domitian I think he was murdered. Again, please forgive me, listeners. My classical knowledge is not brilliant. It just became, it fell into. It was unfashionable. But the history of the area went on. So the Gandolfi, forgive me, family, around 1200, who are a family from Genoa, built their sort of family castle on the hill, sort of amid the ruins of this sort of Roman area. It was a square fortress with tall crenellated walls, small courtyard, nothing kind of particularly glam. And then it became the property of the Savelli family, who kept it for about 300 years. But then everything basically changed. So in 1596, Clement VIII, Pope Clement VIII, took possession of the castle from a Savelli family because they had refused to honour a debt that they owed the papacy. And so it was declared an inalienable patrimony of the Holy See, and sort of incorporated into the papal properties in 1604. But nothing sort of then my understanding is that it was basically just a sort of one of many properties, and cardinals could go and visit it and have a bit of a holiday there, because it was considered to have lovely views and much more healthy air, and it was cooler in the summer and all this kind of thing. And it was Urban VIII who particularly enjoyed staying there as a cardinal. And Urban VIII was poping around between 1623 and 1644. And it was him basically who sort of decided to create what we now recognize.
Now, Rory, am I right in saying Castel Gandolfo is in fact the name of the entire town, and that the actual palace has a much longer name, which is just always abbreviated to the name of the town? So I think when I was doing some reading, the palace's name is the Palazzo Apostolico di Castel Gandolfo. Forgive me for my Italian pronunciation. So it's essentially the Palace of Castel Gandolfo. Is that right?
I believe so. Yes.
Okay. So. And so we got to this point now where the papacy, the Vatican has sort of seized this estate off the family who owned it before. Remind me, their names were the
Savelli family.
The Savelli family. That's right. And that was in 1596. And they then. And then you mentioned we then get Pope Urban VIII, and tell us a bit about him, because he's the one who really transforms this place, isn't he?
He is, yes. And so basically, he has a bit of a sort of bee in his bonnet about the fact that popes want to get out, like anyone, especially in this period when there was no air conditioning. Everyone wants to get out of Rome in the summer. because it's just way too hot. And so people would want to go in the spring and the autumn, especially away, get some good air, and the popes are no exception, basically. And I think, courts at the time often, I mean, if you look at the Tudor court, or the Stuart court, for example, which is sort of roughly contemporaneous with this, they would be traveling around the country at certain times on their summer progresses and things, and the Pope was the head of the papal court. So this was all fairly kind of standard stuff. But the problem was the popes didn't really have anywhere to go, and so they were often reliant on staying with people who would open up their houses to them. But this, of course, is a bit awkward if you're Pope, because you don't particularly want to be living off favors when you're that powerful. So he basically decides to renovate this wonderful hilltop castle, which he likes going to. And the quote is, to ensure that popes had the convenience of spending the summer in their own palaces rather than having to stay in other people's homes. So this was basically what he did. And he did it, I have to say, with aplomb. So he was the first pope, therefore, to spend his holidays at the residence, which he'd had majorly spruced up. And this was done by Carlo Maderno, who was also the architect who did he was Swiss, who did the facade of St. Peter's Basilica. So the popes were, doing a lot of building at this time.
So he's a Baroque architect.
Exactly. But what's so confusing, Geoff? I mean, it's not confusing in a way, because St. Peter's is a church and Castel Gandolfo is not. But the architecture is incredibly plain. I mean, the interest here in many ways really is the history rather than the design. The gardens are lovely, and we'll talk about those in a moment.
But much plainer than that facade that he did at St. Peter's.
Yeah, it's really plain. I mean, it's sort of, as I said, the sort of wide castle-like base that sort of tapers into a white, creamy sort of. It's not in any way symmetrical. It's sort of very tall walls, but with sort of classical windows and shutters. But it's very, very lightly classical.
Okay.
And the entrance facade, which we'll get to in a moment, is a little bit more imposing, but not much at all. The initial blueprints happened, and he's also done other lovely things in Castel Gandolfo, like planted it with these when you see pictures, it's got all these lovely tree-lined avenues and things. And he implemented a little garden as well, which is particularly lovely, with myrtle hedges and things like that. But anyway, it was the next pope to kind of take a serious interest, because a lot of them didn't. A lot of them would like to stay in Rome, or had other places they like to go to. But the next guy was Pope Alexander VII, and he was around not in the early 1600s, but in the kind of mid 1600s. So he made it even more palatial, really, and he introduced probably the most famous interior element, which is this large gallery, which is painted by Pier Leone Ghezzi. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, with sort of beautiful, airy paintings of sort of views of the Alban hills. So when you're walking down this corridor, it's a little bit like you're looking out of a sort of a colonnade onto a landscape beneath you, rather than at a painting. It's very, very lovely. And that's the picture. That's the room that's always photographed in interior shots. But
Rory, that room, it has this extraordinary plasterwork on the ceiling as well. Is that right? So it has these sort of frescoes down the walls of sort of very rural, idyllic scenes. Is that right? Sort of, like you said, the local countryside.
Yes.
And I think if I'm picturing the gallery correctly, as you said, it is sort of like an enclosed colonnade, isn't it? Because there are windows rather than open arches. But then it has this amazing sort of almost Rococo, but it's not Rococo. It's sort of very pretty plasterwork. I can't quite tell, though, when I've seen pictures in the past, if it's plasterwork or paint.
Well, I know. I mean, it's rather embarrassing, listeners. I'm actually looking this up right now to check that I'm not mistaken. I'm looking at it again. It is incredibly fine, isn't it?
It is. It's hard to tell if it's actually 3D and plasterwork, or if it's actually painted on.
I think it's trompe l'oeil. I think it's painted on. Looking at this again, I'm pretty sure it's painted on.
We should actually do a podcast series on trompe l'oeil, because there's some brilliant country houses all over the world that have fantastic examples of trompe l'oeil. There's that wonderful violin on the back of the door at Chatsworth, isn't there?
Yes.
Okay,
I agree,
good.
that would be fun. Anyway, yes.
There's
So,
an extraordinary room. So this was added by Alexander the
for the
Seventh. You
seventh,
say?
yeah, and he was clearly, he was a big patron of Bernini. So the Bernini also did this sort of beautiful church in the square of the in front of the palace, which is very lovely. He also, I believe, added the front facade on the square, which is quite sort of, it's very pared back, but it's very symmetrical. It's got sort of tapers into this clock. It's got a sort of papal balcony where the Pope can sort of address the square. It's lovely, and this Pope was sort of particularly famous for long walks in the countryside. He basically absolutely adored walking down the paths and kind of meditating and taking his sort of papal barge out onto the lake and sort of, communing with the landscape. And that in a way kind of sets a precedent for what the later popes use it for. It's really a place for meditation, exercise, a way of getting away from the intensely political atmosphere of the Vatican. Because let us not forget, listeners, that at this time the Rome is run by the Pope, and Rome is the center of the papal states, which is quite a large amount of, it's the size of a country, which the Pope runs. And so he's not just a spiritual leader; he's also, the ruler of a not insubstantial area, and also on top of that, having to sort of, spiritually lead all the Catholics in the world at the time as well. So he's a busy man.
I find it interesting, Rory, thinking of that in terms of the character and role of the Pope. You see that reflected, I think, a lot in Castel Gandolfo in terms of the contrast between the I think it's called the pontificate bedroom, the room the bedroom that the Pope sleeps in, compared to the public rooms. Because, of course, on the one hand, we know the Catholic Church is all about, glorifying God through beauty and creation and creating beautiful buildings and architecture. Yet at the same time, we know that, Christ's teachings were about humility, and the first will be last and the last will be first. And so we see that, I think, reflected in the Castello, because the Pope's bedroom is incredibly simple from what I've seen pictures of. It's a simple single brass bedstead. Of course, the Pope is unmarried. It's a single bed, brass bedstead, plain walls, no frescoes, no plasterwork, no gilding. And it's interesting that he has that for his private room, and possibly linking with the idea of the meditation, the simplicity of it, the wholesome nature of being in the countryside. But then some of the entertaining rooms are much grander, and so it's this constant sort of tension within the church.
I totally agree. I've always been fascinated by it. I mean, I'm not going to be talking too much about the interiors, because as we'll discover as we go on, I think that the palace was attacked a number of times, and the interiors, I think, were heavily damaged, and so it's quite hard to recreate a picture of what they looked like at different times, apart from those main rooms. But I agree, there is this tension, and it's strange, isn't it? Because the domestic quarters for the Pope himself are monastic, really, because he's ultimately, kind of in many ways a glorified monk. But the kind of setting and yes, and the formal functions are that of a palace, because he's a ruler, and so it is a strange dichotomy. I agree, and that is often best reflected in architecture. Actually, that strange variety of functions that the Pope.
I always find that it reminds me a little bit of Leighton House in Holland Park, which I visited a few months ago, having been renovated. And again, you had the same thing where Leighton has this extraordinary sort of Victorian house with the most amazing Moorish interiors, very ornate. And then you go to his bedroom. There's only one bedroom in the whole house, because he didn't ever want guests to. I think there's two, actually. I think there's one for his housekeeper and a small bedroom for him. He never wanted house guests. He would throw the most amazing parties, but always sent them home that same night. And in his bedroom was so plain. I mean, again, it's a single bed tucked against the wall, and it's funny, isn't it? That strange sort of that contrast between the hosting lavish parties and then withdrawing to very simple. I don't know what you find, Rory, but I like I always find being in too big a bedroom, it feels too voluminous, it feels too echoey. I love being in a little, and I always when I've stayed in hotels, I've always felt much more comfortable in the smaller rooms. Hilariously.
I'm sorry. I'm afraid whenever I'm in a big room, I'm like, boom, it's party time. It's fantastic.
Well, I think it's probably because I'm a Puritan at heart.
Yeah, so I'm for listeners. This episode is special to me because I'm a lapsed terrible Catholic, and so for me it's very exciting to be exploring my my spiritual roots through this episode. And actually, in fairness, I mean we'll talk about it later, but I was quite sad by the passing of Pope Francis. Actually, I was quite keen on him. But anyway, we digress.
We
But
digress. So tell me, so can we link back now to? So we've talked about the. Is there more to understand the architecture, Rory?
there's a bit more. There's some interesting stuff here about how the popes actually used it.
I assume
So
there's a
basically,
chapel.
there's I mean there's quite a lot of different. There's a chapel inside the palace, and then there were a lot of different sort of smaller chapels, which I think kind of dotted the grounds. And then there was obviously the one that Bernini built. So it's quite hard to keep track of them because, again, I think some of them were destroyed during the various conflicts, which we will discuss.
Okay.
But it basically officially becomes the sort of Pope's villa in the early 18th century under Clement XI. At which point the citizens of Castel Gandolfo basically have the privilege of not being run by the standard administration, but being run by the prefect of the Apostolic Palace. So at this point, we begin to see this area becoming quite special, quite holy, as it were. Then the kind of the premises is expanded with the acquisition of the Villa Cibo, which is sort of very lovely. We see more kind of garden stuff. So this garden has expanded even more with wonderful marbles and statues and fountains, and the sort of improvements of the already Roman ruins within it, which is, I think, just totally magical. Then there's these wonderful anecdotes about the popes using it, and I just absolutely adore these. So we've got Clement XIV, who apparently was very lively. And when he was at the castle, he didn't limit himself to short walks through the famous galleries and villas. Instead, he often left the palace on his horse in a white traveling outfit with white riding boots and a white tricorn. And then he used to get totally carried away, and he would, the moment he was sort of out of sight of all the villagers, he'd break into a gallop so fast that his escorts couldn't keep up with him. And he used to love doing this, and he kept doing it until 1771 when he fell off. And luckily he survived, but his family were like, "No, you're not allowed to do this anymore," which he was very grumpy about.
That's amazing. Was that what I mean? I know some popes used to. I mean, they indulged in all the activities that the aristocratic class would indulge in terms of things like hunting and. Was this? Do you know if this was a good area for them to do sort of country pursuits apart from the riding?
It's interesting. I haven't actually heard. I mean, when I was doing my research, I didn't see any reference to it. Hunting,
but they would. I mean, I'm also intrigued because it's much closer to Rome than a sort of holiday home traditionally is, in that it's only 25 miles. Would they use it at weekends throughout the year, for example, or was it really only in the summer?
We'll get there. They start to. But at this point, it's a little bit too far. They will basically go there for spring and the autumn, for maybe a few weeks. Some popes don't use it at all. I mean, we're jumping, as you can tell, we're jumping periods. So quite a lot of the time it's just left, or they'll go there for a little bit. They often go there if they're ill to recover, for example.
Okay.
Anyway, everything.
Have you any more fun anecdotes, Rory?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a battle there. So in 1798, when Napoleon's troops are starting to cause havoc in Italy, there's this bloody sort of battle between the villagers in Castel Gandolfo and the troops of the Napoleonic troops, the troops of, maybe it wasn't Napoleonic by that point, but the French troops under Murat. And there was this fight, and all these villagers took refuge in the palace, and they were shot by cannons and plundered by French troops, and it was all pretty dramatic. And this is when everything starts to sort of go a bit wrong for the papacy, because the Pope ends up being arrested and sort of held prisoner and all this kind of thing by Napoleon.
So that, I suppose that sort of takes us through to sort of the very how Italy's landscape changed immensely in the 19th century. Is that sort of where we're at now?
So now we get to the kind of, we're beginning to enter more modern times under Pius IX, and he was the last pope who was in charge of the Papal States. And
can you very quickly say what the Papal States were?
Sure. So we mentioned them a bit earlier, but the Papal States, basically, it was a slightly strange concept. But when Italy was not unified, there were different bits. So you had sort of mainly actually around the famous cities that we know today. So
Little kingdoms, basically.
exactly, kingdoms. So you had, and I'm a bit rusty on them, but you had that area. You had one around Milan. You had one around Venice. You had
The
one around
Medici in Florence.
Florence.
Yeah.
You had the one around Naples, which I think was under the king. It was the king of
The
Naples.
King of Naples, yeah.
And so you had all these sort of very rich cities. They were called city-states, really. And Rome was no exception. And Rome was the center of the papal states, which were very large. And they were gradually encroached on as the power of the papacy declined, especially with the Reformation. But they amazingly they didn't end. They were the last bastion to hold out when Italy was being unified under Garibaldi. And Rome sort of was not conquered until 1870, and so until then, the capital of Italy, this unified Italy, was Turin. Anyway, so the Pope was sitting there in Rome, kind of twiddling his thumbs, feeling cross. Finally, got
And when you say it was captured in 1870, captured by whom?
captured by the new king of Italy,
The self-declared king of a united Italy, unified Italy.
exactly. And the Pope, I mean, they didn't kill him. He basically became, well, we're slightly jumping ahead again, but he becomes a prisoner in the Vatican. But he was called Pius IX, and he was loved at Castel Gandolfo. He was really loved because he used to wander around the town on foot and enter the homes of these people, and he would lift their cooking pots to see if they had enough food in them, and if they didn't, he'd kind of give them alms. He was considered to be very wholesome. But anyway, at the end of the Papal States,
It sounds
he
like he was quite pious, Rory.
well, you could say that, Geoff. You could say that. But he declares himself basically a prisoner of war. He becomes a self-imposed prisoner in the Vatican. He doesn't leave it. And what's unbelievable is that the Vatican, it's not actually that big. No pope leaves it from 1870 until 1929, I believe. And obviously the popes change because no one.
So when they become the Pope, they then don't. When they're appointed as the Pope, they then don't leave the Vatican.
Yeah, because there's this really weird grey area. No one is, until Mussolini, no one is powerful enough or sort of bold enough to actually decide what to do about this issue, because the Pope is sort of technically this kind of king. So it's a kind of moot point, basically. So it's all mad.
What happened to Castel Gandolfo in that period from
It just
1870
sits
to
there.
1929?
It's really weird. It's being run by the Pope, but the Pope never visits it. No one dares touch it, but it's also not visited. But then after
Does it
1920,
decline? Does it decline in terms of, does it start to rot, or is it kept up?
I don't think so. Not particularly. I mean,
Okay.
it's such as the papacy is so powerful, no one wants to see it decline. But equally, and I think it's a bit of a kind of bleak house situation. Like you get in a Dickensian novel, sort of housekeepers kind of keeping the house ready should they come, the owner come to visit type thing.
Sure. And so it was still unused through the First World War, and it was only in the interwar period that something changed. What happened in 1929?
Well, the whole nature of the papacy totally changes. So after 1929, you have the Lateran Treaty between the Holy See and Italy, which basically ends this kind of Cold War between the Vatican and Italy. And basically, this is when the Vatican state is created that we know today, which is this sort of tiny little mini state in the center of Rome, which is its own country. And Castel Gandolfo is it's quite complicated. It is on Italian territory, but it's given sort of extraterrestrial status. It's rather similar to that of diplomatic centers. It's exempt from Italian
The
taxes.
diplomatic community, it's not.
Yes, Italian authorities are not allowed to enter it without the consent of the Pope. It's sort of it's to all intents and purposes a slice of the Vatican outside the Vatican. So it's got a very strange position legally. But anyway, so rather interestingly, there were lots of other villas that were discussed. That they even thought about making the Villa Farnese, the kind of papal holiday house, but they decided not to. And eventually, after 1929, it was renovated. It needed to be modernized a bit. Interestingly, when it was renovated, the gardens were massively expanded. So at this point, we begin to see the emergence of the gardens that we kind of recognize today, which are absolutely exquisite. That's really the most lovely thing about it. It's got these lovely terrace gardens which roll down the hill.
In
One of
that
the most
classic sort of Italian, actually, sort of really, it was sort of revived in the early 20th century. So it was a good time when you think about the great gardens of Italy, especially when you think about ones like the ones
the
around
Boboli
around
Gardens in
Rome. Yeah,
Florence.
exactly. Probably, but also it's less Renaissance. It's more sort of, like you said, it's sort of wonderful box hedging and parterres, little mazes, and all sorts of things like that, isn't it? And lemon groves and citrus groves and all sorts of
It's
things.
stunning. It's a very complicated geometric hedges planted with colourful flowers on one parterre, and then another one. There's a Belvedere fountain with great sort of aquatic gods looking marvelous. Then there are these wonderful avenues of cypresses and kind of huge mazes, as you said. I mean, it's absolutely lovely. All with these unbelievable views, just completely to die for, disappearing off into the haze. It's. I mean, you can understand why the popes wanted to get there, wanted to get away there, because it really is. And until we'll get there in a moment, but until very recently, a total mystery. It was only Pope Francis who opened up the gardens to the public. So until then, it was an absolute mystery as to what they were like.
Well, they were like, it's interesting, and I suppose it's only in the last 50 years that we have aerial views, because planes and helicopters and whatever can fly over, because there are very few photographs, as you would have found, Rory, on the gardens and the interiors of the palace, because it's been secret. It's sort of been so private for so long. But there are
Yes,
lots of aerial photographs, and actually, what I was reminded of with the aerial photographs is the way the gardens have been designed to sort of splay out from the palace. You've got these sort of wonderful, almost like rays of a sun, these wonderful sort of paths that go out, not in straight lines, but sort of coming out of the palace in different angles. And it reminds me quite a lot of the an amazing garden, also early 20th century in Tuscany, the Villa La Foce in the Val d'Orcia, which has, again, very similar. It sits on this sort of precipice with this amazing view over the Val d'Orcia. And I remember, Rory, when slight side note, when I was living in Qatar, in Doha, in a hotel room in 50-degree heat and craving European culture, I watched Monty Don's Italian Gardens, and I think amongst the gardens were Castel Gandolfo and this one La Foce, and it was a golden time for Italian gardens. And tell me, I think there's a scene, and we'll get on to the two popes later, but there's a scene in that movie about the two popes where I think he's sort of picking lemons or something. Was there an element where the popes would in the garden cultivate it themselves, grow things themselves? That sort of humility coupled with the grandeur.
I've read quite a detailed account of Castel Gandolfo, and I haven't come across that of the history of it. I haven't seen that, but it
I
wouldn't
suppose
surprise me if it
that
did.
might not be, yeah, if a pope's going clipping box hedges, it might not be the sort of thing they chronicle, but it could well be.
Exactly. I think there's quite a lot that isn't officially chronicled, because the descriptions do seem, in a way, quite sort of stilted. I think there's an awful lot of meditation and prayer and walking and meeting locals and riding and sailing and all this kind of thing. But
So we get to
anyway,
1989. It's the treaty's been signed. They're starting to use the palace again, and
yeah.
then we see the rise of Mussolini and the breakout of the Second World War. What happened to the papacy and the Castello at that point?
So at that point, it enters a rather interesting sort of world of its own in World War II. So um, the Pius the 11th, who's the guy who sort of oversees the resurgence of the castle after the decline of the Papal States, after the sort of rejuvenation of the Vatican State, etc. He dies. I think he might even die there, maybe he doesn't. But on the eve of his death, he repeatedly denounces the doctrine of racial nationalism, culminating in this very memorable radio message on the 29th of September 1938, where he offers to exchange his life for peace, which is incredibly moving. Then the next Pope, Pius the 12th, from there on the 24th of August 1939, he broadcasts an appeal to end conflict, So he says the danger is imminent, but there is still time. Nothing is lost with peace. All may be lost with war. This is all from Castel Gandolfo. Then in the war, I mean, sadly, the war does break out, and the castle becomes defensive again. So the sort of all the residents of the area pour into the pontifical villas, where they're kind of granted a degree of protection.
Because you're now in this situation where suddenly, especially if the papacy has denounced what Mussolini's doing, suddenly because of the nature of these extraterrestrial, not extraterrestrial, whatever it is, not part of the not part of Italy, so to speak. It's suddenly they're surrounded by enemies, aren't they? Because the Pope's just denounced Mussolini.
I don't think the Pope did denounce what Mussolini was doing per se. I think it was a lot more subtle than that.
A plea for peace rather than okay.
Yeah, I think it
but
was quite.
Either way, they were the papal state, the Holy See, the Pope and his sort of people were not at war, yet they were surrounded by a country that was. I suppose that's the point. Is Italy was by this point, 1939, Italy's now at war.
Yeah.
And you've got these almost a little bit like Switzerland being surrounded by countries that are at war. You've got the same sort of thing here, haven't you? In that Castel Gandolfo is all the people outside of the palace are expected. There's probably, well, I imagine there was, conscription or national service, and yet I imagine the people within the Castello were immune from that. And so there's sort of this tension again, isn't there?
That I don't know. I'm not sure what the policy was there, but what I do know is that because it was a very sacred place, the area was granted a degree of sort of protection. But that didn't save it. But that didn't save it. It got bombed. So quite a lot of people died
by the Italians, by the French.
I think, sadly, by the Allies, actually. And
people died in this bombing.
Yes. There's a stat I read that 500 people died. I think there was clearly some sort of awful direct hit.
And was it used? We know, obviously, in England, many houses were requisitioned by the government, turned into hospitals or officers' messes or whatever. Now, I appreciate that they would have been immune from being requisitioned, so to speak, by the Italian government, but did they choose to be used as a hospital or something like that?
Well, yes. So the Pope let 12,000 people take refuge there until the liberation of Rome on the 4th of June. The papal apartment was reserved for women who were about to deliver babies. 40 babies were born in the papal apartments. A lot of Jewish refugees took shelter there as well. So it was a hive of activity,
it's weird to think that in the First World War it was sitting there empty, with the housekeeper waiting to see if the Pope would ever return, sort of thing. And in the Second World War, in just 20-year period, how it was transformed into a hive of activity. It's interesting.
It's really interesting and very moving, I think, and it just presents a complicated picture of kind of papal activity, Catholic activity in World War II, because the Pope was often attacked by historians at the time. The Pope at the time is often attacked by historians for having not done enough. But here is an example of the papacy quite literally providing shelter. So it's a complicated story, but we march on.
The liberation of Rome, and then what happens then in the second half of the 20th century?
So basically, after World War II, the Pope resumes using it for summer holidays, which lasts for a while. In fact, Pope Pacelli spent almost a third of his pontificate there, and he was the first pope to die at Castel Gandolfo in 1958. And then Pope John the 23rd, I'm reading Roman numerals, everyone, this is quite difficult, reinstated some lovely traditions there, including the recitation of the Angelus in the palace courtyard on Sunday mornings, which is absolutely exquisite. Paul the Sixth started. Now this is when the kind of week ending started. So Paul the Sixth starts to take weekly journeys by helicopter to the palace. So at that point, it becomes a bit like Windsor Castle for the royal family for our late Queen. Then, interestingly enough, then we have this whole, debacle with the Pope being elected and then dying after 33 days or whatever it is, and then we get Pope John Paul II. And interestingly, Pope John Paul went there to kind of, before he was made Pope, to sort of relax and gain a bit of peace before the kind of onslaught of the of the kind of, well, of his election, I suppose. He's the guy who kind of breaks with hundreds of years of tradition and doesn't just go there in the summer, but sort of throughout the year. And also, rather controversially, I believe built a swimming pool there and was papped by the paparazzi with his swimming pool. So,
oh, really? So he really turned it into a proper holiday home, really.
I wouldn't go that far, but
from a meditation retreat. Well, I'm sure he still used it for meditation, but he made the most of it, which is good.
He made this, it was good. And then we sort of get to the thing that made it famous in recent history, which is this extraordinary moment when Pope Benedict decides to step back as Pope and Pope Francis becomes Pope, which of course is the underlying narrative behind the film The Two Popes, which is a very, very wonderful film if you haven't seen it. And people who've seen the film will remember that there are some amazing scenes at Castel Gandolfo, the actual Castel Gandolfo in the film. This is all highly fictionalized, but there is an element of truth to it. So basically, the director of the pontifical villas was told that Benedict would move to Castel Gandolfo on the 28th of February while he waited for a palace. For a place to be organized for him in the sort of special monastery where he was going to retire after having stepped down as Pope. And he arrived, and it was very moving. He appeared on the balcony, and the whole town came out to see him, and sort of chanting, and it was all this very kind of special, significant moment. And the flag, rather like with royal palaces in the UK, the flag that is always raised to sort of signify when the Pope's there was brought down was lowered, and that kind of was very symbolic and everything. And then Pope Francis visited a bit later on the 23rd of March 2013, so a few weeks later, and there was this very moving moment when they they had lunch, and it was extraordinary to see these two popes together. But most importantly, they went to pray together in the private chapel in the palace. And Benedict gestured to offer Francis the kneeler, which was reserved for the Pope. And Pope Francis characteristically refused to take it. And he instead invited Benedict to kneel beside him, and they knelt together and prayed together. And it was a very, very symbolic moment of the old Pope giving way to the new one, and the new one deferring to the old one. And it was a very kind of important moment in the Catholic Church. Catholics globally as well. So that basically takes us up to the very present day, Geoff.
Yeah. So tell me, how Pope Francis then used it, or did he use it at all? And what's the palace used for today?
So Pope Francis wasn't sort of particularly keen on it, I don't think. I mean, we all know he was very. He led a very simple life, and I think that even the relative simplicity of the papal holiday house, as it were, was he just didn't use it particularly. I think he went a bit. So in 2014, it was the gardens were open to visitors, which was a major moment because, as we've said, they were a mystery, and people were, I think, really quite taken aback by how exquisite they are. And then in 2015, the public was able to travel from the Vatican to the retreat by train, but had previously been reserved for use by the Pope. Products from the farm.
So this train line from the Vatican to Castel Gandolfo was solely for the use of the Pope's train initially, and then it became a public train line. Is that right?
Well, I'm not sure. I was a bit confused by that because I thought that, maybe it was just the train specifically, or I can't believe that a whole train line was just reserved for the Pope. I could be wrong.
Or maybe it was just the estate station. We know that Castle Howard had an estate station that was
exactly
only trains going to Castle Howard would stop there, sort of thing. Yeah.
Yes. Anyway, there's also a farm on the ground because it's quite a big area of land. that was the products of which were only available for Vatican employees, but now they can be purchased by everyone. And then finally, in 2016, the palace was opened for viewing by the public. So it effectively became a museum. And rather interestingly, the mayor of the town, when he was asked, what's the state now, what's going to happen, he said that the fact that the palace is now a museum will make a reversal in the future difficult. So that seems to be subtle signaling that perhaps Castel Gandolfo's time as the weekend retreat of the popes has come to an end, and it's another one of their properties. But we don't know.
I suppose, yeah. I suppose, if you would, I appreciate it's a different kettle of fish to a country house, but we've had occasions when country house owners' grandparents started opening it to the public, the families moved out, it was totally open to the public, and then the next generation takes over and they convert part of it back into apartments or whatever. So I suppose there is a possibility, if you were to apply that same logic here, that if a future pope really wanted to use it, he could perhaps maintain private apartments there, even if parts of it were open to a bit like the Vatican City, for example, which we know is open to the public and is the Pope's residence. Now, Rory, I've been puzzling for a while about the fact that there appeared to be these domes, but they didn't look like Baroque domes like at the Vatican City. Yes. And I realized now it's the Vatican Observatory. Do you know much about the Vatican Observatory?
I knew you were going to ask that question. Unfortunately, it's not terribly interesting. Basically, I think they were added in the 20s after the sort of end of the Treaty of Lateran, whatever it was called, because there was an observatory in Rome, but the quality of light, etc., wasn't good enough, so they decided to go to this wonderful hill. But then, even then, the quality of light, they quickly realized actually wasn't good enough, and so I think they've moved the Vatican Observatory again. So I don't.
But I think they left the actual observatory is still at Castel Gandolfo. It's just they opened a new one, I think, a few miles away in the countryside. Because I think when you look at it, the actual observatory domes, the telescopes are still there.
Yes.
What I find interesting is I suppose it's a tangent, but the long history of the papacy embracing and being interested in science. So we know that for centuries, I mean, the Gregorian calendar, for example, named after Pope Gregory VIII, was developed by a physicist and an astronomer called Aloysius Lilius, who was patronized by Pope Gregory. And so I find it interesting that throughout history, we so often think that religion and science are in tension with each other, and yet so many of the great scientific discoveries, particularly in physics and astronomy, were done through Vatican money or Vatican patronage. I think it's quite interesting that we see throughout that even today there is a working, albeit not at Castel Gandolfo, but there's a working Vatican City or Holy See Observatory. I find it, and I think there's always a Catholic priest who is the sort of astronomer in residence. And so I was reading about this guy earlier. There's an American Catholic priest called Brother Guy Gonsalmagno, who is actually a physicist and an astronomer. He's director of the Vatican Observatory, yet he is. And I just find it interesting when so often we're told, at school or by the press or whatever, that science can't be squared with faith and with Christianity. And I just find it interesting that far from sort of fighting, far from getting involved with that argument, the papacy almost shows that you can have the two side by side. I find it an interesting side note, really.
No, it is really interesting. It's quite surprising. One wouldn't expect it. I agree. And the Vatican is like that. I mean, it's an extraordinary organism, ecosystem even. I mean, I think someone told me friends went to go and visit, and they said that there are cash points in the Vatican City, and all the you can only use Roman numerals or something completely nuts, or they're in Latin, or I can't remember, something like that, which I was absolutely amazed by. It's an extraordinary place, but this is what I sort of said at the beginning with this thing about Domitian's villa. I mean, the tale of his history is just nuts. I mean, most of the time, when we're studying a country house, we'll say, well, there was a sort of medieval manor, and then there's the Reformation, and then boom, we're off. But what happens before the medieval manor? Anyone's guess. Nobody knows. But with the Vatican, I mean, there's just all these records, and they just go back and back and back and back and back, and you just find yourself thinking, when's this going to end? And then suddenly you find yourself in the Roman Empire. It's absolutely extraordinary. And there's just sort of this sense of being so deeply rooted in the past from a historian's perspective. It's just amazing, absolutely amazing.
The great Baroque architect Bernini, who of course designed the collegiate church in Castel Gandolfo, and it's interesting though because I was reading about this, and it's a bit like the palace itself, which you mentioned, was designed by the Swiss Baroque architect, and yet is very plain. It's interesting, Bernini is famous for his extraordinary Baroque sculptures and architecture and monuments, and that famous bridge, Ponte di San Angelo. And yet, if you look at pictures of the collegiate church of St. Thomas of Villanova, which is the sort of main church in Castel Gandolfo, the reason why I love it is it's a little bit like an Italian church version of Holcomb, I think, because it's got this very plain, austere Palladian facade, which is very un-Bernini-like, I think. And you go inside, and there's this amazing sort of reredos behind the altar of sort of fantastic gilded Corinthian columns and this enormous oval painting of Christ on the cross. And a huge sort of marble sculpture above, and I just find it. I've been quite interested in it because I love I love buildings that surprise you, and Rory, you and I were at Castle Howard 2 weeks ago, and it's the most magnificent house, but you expect the interiors from the exterior because the exterior is so fantastically Baroque. In terms of you don't expect them; they're stunning, but you're not surprised by the beauty within because of the beauty without. Outside. Whereas what I find interesting with this one by Bernini is it's so plain, you're quite surprised when you go inside, I think. But anyway, it's a complete side note. But
no, it's gorgeous. I agree. Those kind of altars, sort of marble, kind of almost writhing, into different shapes, is extraordinary. But I think this plainness is a feature of Castel Gandolfo, which is rather notable, and it is a contrast with the Vatican itself and St. Peter's. It's all pretty plain. I was googling the interiors, and they are plain. The walls do seem to be largely whitewashed. You might have some quite nice sort of ceiling decoration, but really it's a place of retreat in the religious sense. And yes, you've got that nice corridor, and yes, you've got the nice church with the marble altar and these amazing gardens. But ultimately, none of it seems to me congruous with the idea of going to a beautiful place to meditate and pray and to recharge, which many thousands of hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people do as part of their own sort of religious journeys.
Rory, before we sort of wind up, I'm just thinking it's interesting that every sort of head of state has their principal seat and then a sort of country residence. You think about the president of the US, he's got the White House, and he's got Camp David, you've got Chequers here. If you could, based on summer residences, solely based on summer residences, if you could choose to be a head of state based on which residence you would get, which would you choose?
And you're right. That's absolutely how I would choose which head of state to be. It would be based on their country house. Good question. What a proposition. The problem is that they're all so private, aren't they? That actually we don't, a lot of them we don't really know about. I mean, I think. Not American. Sorry.
Camp David's not that pretty, is it?
I'm sorry to people who like Camp David. Apologies to our American listeners. Would I want Balmoral or Sandringham or? Actually, hang on. I'm not. Are we talking royal family or prime minister? Sorry.
Well, head of state or prime minister. You can go for Chequers. That's fine. I mean, we're unusual having a prime minister and a queen that we've got sort of two.
Yeah, I'm afraid. Do you know what? I'd probably choose the French. awfully. I know this is outrageous betrayal, but the French,
Why? 'Cause they get apartments at Versailles.
the French presidential chateaux, if you ever look them up, are just unbelievable. I mean, whew. I think there's one on an island, which was done up by the sort of, I don't know, the wife of General de Gaulle or something like that, and it's just mesmerizing. What about
Oh
you?
yeah, I know the one. It's that Fort de Bretagne or something. It's a very pretty. I think yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, I do, solely from a sort of fascination perspective. The Prime Minister of India's country house, which is official residence, which is the Viceregal Palace. I can't pronounce his name now. Forgive me to our lovely Indian listeners. That extraordinary building designed by Lutyens. I'm always sort of entranced by that, because the way Lutyens wove in all these beautiful things like rills and leats and wonderful little streams in little gullies, and I think it's
Are you talking about the one in
Delhi?
Yeah,
it's not really country residence, but it kind of was. Oh, I suppose his country residence was in Shimla, wasn't it?
Yeah,
the lodge. Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
Really weird. It looks like
Yeah.
it's extraordinary.
It's like a sort of English country house, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure how I feel about sort of imperial mock Jacobean houses. They're just sort of very strange.
I think, to be honest with you, Rory, I think it would be Chequers. I think I'd have to be the British Prime Minister to get Chequers, and that would be, of all the country houses in the world, I think my official country residence being Chequers, I'll be very happy with.
Very good. Well, very nice to be talking to you, Maggie. This is
Rory, it's been fascinating, and it's intriguing to see. Do you know when the conclave is going to be? Do we know yet? The selection of the new pope.
I think it has been announced, but I don't actually know. No, but it's going to be pretty soon, isn't it?
Sorry, actually, it is. I just checked. It's on May the 7th is when the conclave opens, which will be Wednesday. And for our lovely listeners, we're recording this the day before it goes live. So we're recording this on Monday. You'll be able to listen to it from Tuesday and on Wednesday. So by the time we have another episode after this one, there will be, hopefully, if things go to plan, a new pope, which is very exciting.
Very exciting. Well,
yes, well, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Rory. It's been fascinating.
No, thank you for asking great questions. And we are, as a podcast, thinking about all our Catholic listeners, and we hope that the conclave goes smoothly. We are thinking about Pope Francis, and it's been lovely to spend a bit of time thinking about this at this timely moment.
Well, you've got me itching to go back to Italy. I forget how many extraordinary houses and villas and palaces and all sorts there are there, and castellos, and it is, I think, spring and autumn. I don't blame the popes for wanting to go there in the spring and autumn, because it is a magical time, and I'm itching to get back. But Rory, thank you for your time today, for your research. Thank you to our lovely listeners for joining us. And we're very excited to announce that we've got a linked in with sort of the classicism of Castel Gandolfo. We've got a very exciting episode next week coming out. We'll give you a little taster on Instagram. We've got 3 special guests, and it's the first episode we've recorded in a studio, and it is the 3 classicists who are perhaps 3 of the foremost classical or traditional architects in the UK today, who are known as the 3 classicists: Ben Pentreath, Francis Terry, and George Summeray Smith. And they have joined us on the anniversary of the 15th anniversary of an exhibition they did at the Royal Institute of British Architects, and it's going to be a really exciting episode, so please do tune in for that. In the meantime, we hope you have a lovely week and enjoy the sunshine. Hopefully we'll have some more of it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.